All right. Um, okay. Um, cool. So, I need to turn my light on. It's like
I
super,
was gonna say,
super pitch
hello,
dark in
darkness,
here.
my old friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. I'm here with Lauren Southern. It's not exactly completely clear what all we're going to be talking about yet, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, I suppose. Lauren, if you want to introduce yourself, yeah.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I guess to your audience, I would be mass terrorist. I don't know,
Mm.
hate crime aficionado, but really, I'm just a mom with pretty regular, normal conservative views. And I'm not sure what Melfi wants to chat with me about today. I just showed up, did what I was asked, my one job.
um, really quickly, I hope you don't consider this to be well poisoning. Is it true that are you banned from any countries?
The UK. I'm not like I wasn't allowed in. So the notice says that I wasn't allowed in for in like bringing hate towards or racism. It said something about racism, which didn't make sense to me because they cited me putting out flyers that said Islam is gay. So
Oh,
I'm not sure
gotcha.
what that has to do with racism, but that's the only country that I'm not allowed
The only one. Okay, that's reassuring.
in.
Um, okay, so
I will have you know, they now do a mass parade in the middle of London every year for Muslim gay pride. So
hmm,
I was just a trendsetter
you're ahead
for
of
that.
the curve. Nice. Yeah.
What is there's a quote on that? It's better to be wrong too late than right too early.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyways, so speaking of the gays, I guess you didn't want to spend too much time on the LGBT stuff, so we don't have to. But I
You
know,
guys messed with it. I don't get it. Like, it's all of the left talk about anymore.
yeah,
It's not even LGBT stuff. Like they kind of did this thing where it's like we don't even care about women's issues
mm,
anymore. We care about LGBT stuff now. We don't even care about gay guys' issues now. It's all trans, like
yeah.
100% trans issues, which seems like it's not like it's not something to talk about, but it just seems like a bizarre strategy to me when that's such a small percentage of the populace.
Yeah, well, I think the idea is just kind of, I guess it seems like most of America on board, at this point is on board with like, not hating women or gay people. So, this is the last group we need to, you know, get normalized, I guess, or something like that. Sorry, what'd you
Like
say? You cut out?
I don't think it's hate. I don't see people around saying I hate transgender
Hmm.
people. Most of the stuff, even like conservative media, it's just like I don't think they should be in women's sports. That seems bizarre to me. I'm not going to, deny that biology exists. It's not a matter of hate. I think that's why those categories are like maybe different, and this is why this has become such a battleground subject, whereas the previous mentioned ones people were like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, so I yeah, so we can go over I guess some of these concerns. Like I said, I know you didn't want to spend too much time on it, but so I guess where are you at generally? Do you more or less share the sentiment that you had in your last video that you made about trans issues? I guess.
I mean, that was probably the longest video I've done on trans issues, and just laid out all of my perspectives, but also an analysis of others' perspectives. And I'm not gonna pretend that this is like my master's or PhD thesis. It's just my analysis of the work on my own time, put out there for other people to analyze themselves. And quite frankly, that's what most YouTubers are doing. I think people speak with way too much expertise in the debate pro communities and otherwise, which ultimately brings down to what I actually think is the core of this debate on hormone blockers, which is what I was particularly talking about, is we're YouTubers. You can't say they're 100% safe. We need more research. More research is always a good thing. Why can't you at least admit that before we put this stuff on children?
Mm-hmm.
That was really my conclusion. Plus a lot of the philosophical questions around it.
Yeah, so I guess we can first address the philosophical questions. I think most of the sort of philosophical debate around trans people centers around are trans women women, are trans men men. Does the claim does a trans woman's claim that she's a woman entail some sort of delusion or some sort of false claim or false belief? That seems to be where I guess most of the philosophical issue is centered around. So I guess where do you stand on that question?
Oh man, I've been trying really hard to understand the language that progressives and leftists use when they talk about this issue because I find 99% of the problems that occur and why people can't even get past the first few seconds of conversation and debate is because people are talking past each other. They don't understand each other. They're using different definitions for words. So I really got into what is gender? What is sex? How do we split these things up? What does it mean to be non-binary? What does all this stuff mean? And I really delved into it to try and understand the definitions and terms, which has quite honestly confused me more. So, for example, the other day I was having a conversation with Ari. Oh, I wish I could remember his last name. He did a conversation with Hunter Avalon. Let me check. Avi
Oh, Avi,
Bitterman.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And we were talking about uh, biology versus kind of what people want to present as publicly. And Avi and rational discourse, or whatever his name was,
Ask yourself, yeah.
agreed with me on the fact that you cannot, like when someone says, I am a trans woman or I am a trans man, they are not suddenly biologically a man or a woman. They're like, that's just a debate in crazier circles. So I'm like, okay, so what are we talking about here? And they're like, we're talking about the gender roles. Okay, so to me, we already have definitions for gender roles, such as if you're masculine or you're feminine. You can have feminine men and you can have masculine women. And is this not just an erasure of the idea of the tomboy, that a woman can be masculine and portray male roles in society without biologically changing her sex? And they seemed to agree with me on that. However, still disagreed that we shouldn't call them and refer to them as the opposite sex, which just kind of blew my mind. So it's like, why? So if a trans woman and a feminine man are the same thing, as in they're both just changing their gender roles in society, what's the difference between them? Does this make James Charles now a woman? Because James Charles presents very feminine and does feminine things and has a very female gender role in society. Is James Charles any less of a man now? Like, you educate me. I am confused.
Yeah, so generally speaking, there's sort of two main elements to the issue of, or to sort of most definitions of gender. There's going to be sort of how somebody externally presents themselves. That's generally going to be one component. And then the other component is going to be something that has more to do with internal identity or maybe a internal sort of set of desires. So we could say, for example, that being trans, if we're talking about the sorts of desires that someone has to hold in order for that person to qualify as trans. We could talk about like having the desire to be treated similar to a given sex, similar to the way that a given sex is treated in society. We could talk about having the desire to appear similar to the way a given sex appears in a society, having the desire to express oneself similar to, you know, a given sex, the way a given sex expresses themselves in society at a given time. Um, so I would say that, you know, we can have like tomboys or tomboys or femboys or whatever who might sort of present in certain ways, but they don't necessarily make the criteria of being the gender just because they sort of often express themselves in those ways. Because in order to actually be the other gender, they would have to have a set of desires which constitute their internal identity or yeah, I think that would generally sum it up.
So you believe in gender roles, and you don't believe that femboys or tomboys quite fit into the definition of the opposite gender role.
Yeah, because it doesn't seem like if someone's just like a tomboy, like they generally express themselves sometimes, and or let's say someone's like a tomboy, they sometimes express themselves in more masculine ways, even though they're a woman. If they still internally identify as a woman and have the desire to be recognized by society as a woman and treated by society as a woman and so on. If they still have those desires, then they would still be considered a woman, on my view and on the view of most, I guess, trans advocates, whatever you want to call people
Right.
who, yeah.
So if someone, let's say someone is trans female to male, but acts feminine in society, are they still trans male? Like this seems very confusing. Like
So,
so let's say someone is wants to be perceived as a male in society but takes on female gender roles after they've transitioned. Are they still a trans man, or are they now just a woman because their desires are to act in feminine ways?
yeah, so, I mean, if it's if we have so the question is a female to male trans person.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they express in feminine ways. Yeah, so I would say that this person, so long as they still have a set of desires to be recognized as a man, even though they often will present in feminine ways. If they still have a desire to be recognized by society as a man, they have that sort of internal identity, etc. They would still qualify as a man in terms of their gender.
So you're focusing a lot on this word desire.
Yeah.
And I know lots of people make memes of it, and I've brought it up before, but what about the desire to be transracial? As this new guy's come out as Korean Ollie London or whatever, or the desire to be trans age. Why is that any less relevant than the desire to be the opposite sex or gender?
Yeah, so well, this is actually something my friend Victor, who is getting his PhD in political theory, really wants me to read into the transracial thing. He thinks there's something to it. I actually am not super familiar with that topic, but what I will say is, I guess when it comes to whether or not the I guess the sort of the normative question of whether or not we should recognize trans women as women and whether or not we should recognize trans men as men. My basic argument for that proposition is it seems like there's good evidence, and I guess maybe this is the next thing to get into. It seems like there's good evidence that when we have a trans woman or when we have a trans man, um, it seems largely beneficial to their psychological well-being, their suicidal ideation, their likelihood of attempting suicide, etc. It seems to benefit trans people in a variety of ways for society to recognize them as the gender that they identify as, and so I think we get some utility out of doing that. If you could make a parallel case for trans age people, I'm sure then yeah, I would say that's fine. I'll plead ignorance. I've not read into any of the literature on that.
Yeah, so that's what I think is the interesting question here, and why I always get frustrated when engaging with this, because I'll see people try to conflate two different groups. They'll conflate people who just want to choose their gender identity whenever they want, which a lot of people have, I think, quite reasonable questions and pushback against, versus people who have gender dysphoria and who legitimately suffer if they are not recognized for the sex or gender that they believe they are, and where they have psychological conditions going on. And when we talk about this group, I feel like people are being bullied into accepting this larger group as well as also having the same relevant concerns. No, you have to call this person on TikTok who randomly decided to change their pronouns today, their pronouns, or they will kill themselves. When they have not been diagnosed with dysphoria, when they are not someone, we have no data on whether they will benefit or not. It just feels like a bullying tactic. And so I really think there needs to be a stark line in the sand of separation between using these arguments of suicide, mental health improvement when we are talking about people with dysphoria versus people who are just random and arbitrarily wanting to change their gender with no diagnosis whatsoever before we use those arguments. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I mean, so certainly there's a distinction to make. So, for example, I think that there's a certain subset of the population for whom it's a good idea to use sort of things like puberty blockers in adolescence, right? Because there are certain correlates that we can identify that seem to correlate to the likelihood of a trans person staying trans and I guess persisting
But that's the
throughout their
question, though.
lives.
Is that what the answer is, them to stay trans? Because people have higher rates of, or lower rates of depression, lower rates of suicidality when they are not trans. So why would we want to encourage someone to remain on a path that is actually going to increase their likelihood of life dissatisfaction versus, I don't know, a more positive path like desistance, which is very likely for a lot of kids who do not take hormones. And they've found that, or most, sorry, not hormones, hormone blockers, they've found that one of the deciding factors in desistance is usually puberty. So to me, it seems that trying to force, or not force rather, but sending people down the path of transgenderism, not to say that you're any worse of a person or you don't deserve to be respected as a person if you are transgender or have dysphoria, but it's not an ideal. It's not something we should want people to have. And if they have the chance to not have that, it seems far more beneficial to try to push people towards that path. And even therapy and talking about it and working with people to, you know, be comfortable in their body and accept their body. Most people benefit from surgeries. Most people are happier after getting eye surgery, bleaching their skin, getting bigger boobs. But I I wonder if that's a socialized thing, and we need to maybe encourage people to accept themselves instead of get mass amount of surgeries to change how they look ethnically or how their bone structure appears.
Yeah, so there's a few things. So I guess the first thing that I just want to address firstly is the idea of, what distinction should there be made, I guess, between sort of more broadly gender expansive people and then people who specifically have dysphoria. Because certainly I agree with you that we get utility out of sort of making a distinction between these two groups in the sense that I think the group of people who genuinely have dysphoria and have certain things that we can identify that seem to correlate with persistence and stuff like that, these people should be given maybe certain treatments and undergo certain therapies that I don't think is totally necessary for people who I guess don't have dysphoria. But on the other hand, recognizing that, so if, we take somebody who just uses they, them, they don't have dysphoria, whatever, they just choose to call themselves non binary or whatever because that's just how they prefer to be called. Um, while I don't think that it's totally necessary to maybe give somebody like this treatment if they don't have dysphoria, that doesn't mean that we have to, I guess, totally disregard like how they identify and say, no, I'm not going to call you they, them. You have to be called he, him, or she, her, or whatever. The way that I look at it is, look, it might not be the case that if you don't call this person they, them, they're going to kill themselves. But nonetheless, I don't see any reason like not to. I mean, if that's what they prefer, generally, I'm in favor of just if it seems harmless and that's what someone prefers, then it seems like the more compassionate thing to do to just, I guess, to call them that. You know, if somebody wants to change their name to like Phoenix or some shit like this when they're a teenager, I'll call them Phoenix. You know, I don't care. Um, I guess in terms of like I guess the more substantive uh, like things that you brought up. So I think that your main point seems to be why should we be pushing kids down a path where they're going to stay trans when instead they
Do you
could.
mind if I
Mhm.
get back to that little philosophical bit you
Yeah,
did?
yeah, sure. Yeah, we can get to their stuff later.
We can move back to, sorry, I know I spoke on the hormone
Hmm.
blockers, but I actually still have a few questions on the philosophical stuff. Um, I think that question of, okay, that sounds like a very reasonable statement. If someone wants to be called they, them, and that makes them feel better, awesome, I'll just do that. But to me, this comes down to a question of, and it's a word you've been using a lot, desire. Do we get to interact with the world and have other people interact with us based on simply our desires? And I fear that we are going to, and some of these desires being backed up by saying, I am going to die if you don't do this. I'm going to kill myself if you guys don't do this because this is my desire. And if I don't get my desire, I will be extremely unhappy. And some people will say this whether they have been diagnosed with a disorder or otherwise. Some people would suggest it's a bit of a bullying tactic to get people to do what they want. Others would say people have legitimate mental crises that need to be addressed. And I worry that we are, if we base our reality on simply what people desire to make people feel good, we are going to bring ourselves down some very bizarre paths. Can you imagine in the future, like you said, this transracial stuff? It's already happening. This Ollie London guy. I need to go to the doctors, and if you don't let me get, you know, tons of tanning, if you don't let me bleach my skin, I am going to be suicidal. I'm going to be unhappy with my life. And then when I get to campus the next day and I identify as trans black, I want to be able to join the black campus groups and go there and tell my story. And the black campus groups sitting there and saying, you don't know our lived experience. You grew up in a white household. This is bizarre. And them saying, do not deny my experience. Just like what we're having happen right now, where women's groups are getting together, like Stand Up for Women New Zealand, which is constantly getting protested and shut down. They just had to win a court case to stop being shut down for being seen as TERFs and transphobic, where they're saying, no, you aren't women. You don't know our lived experience. You don't know what it's like to be born as a female. You can't come and speak for us and be in these groups. How would you feel about someone who just started identifying as black, going and joining black groups talking about their oppression and lived experience? And would it not make sense for some of these people to say, whoa, 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 this is getting a bit absurd here. And just because that's what you desire, and even if you feel like you will kill yourself if we don't acknowledge that you are black and have our same lived experience, like that's no, that still doesn't make it mean we should deny reality. Like, how would you feel about that?
Yeah. So well, there's this part at the end there that you mentioned. Well, I do want to get to the rest of it. There's this thing that you said at the end about denying reality. And the issue there is, I'm not exactly sure what denial of reality is entailed by being trans, right? Because if a trans person says, I'm a woman, a lot of people, I guess, more of your persuasion will say, "Oh, this is a false claim. This is a denial of reality." But it seems as though, in order to make that sort of claim, there has to be an equivocation that happens between what the person actually means, which is just something like, I desire to be treated in this way, I identify in this way, I desire to express myself in this way. There's an equivocation between that and a claim that they are the like opposite sex, like biologically, right? So what I would say is that when a trans person says that they're a woman, they don't mean I have XX chromosomes or I produce large gametes or whatever. They just mean I have this set of desires and these preferences in terms of how I want to express myself. And certainly that claim isn't actually going to be a false claim or a claim that denies reality in any way. Um,
think that comes down to a problem of language usage, because in the English language, when we refer to women, we are generally referring to the female sex. We are referring to someone who does have these certain types of chromosomes. We are referring to someone who does have the ability to give birth and these kind of things, or at least their body was built for that. Some people, of course, they're infertile, but we once again we do have words for people who desire to be seen as feminine. In fact, if you go to somewhere like the Philippines, there are a lot of people there that they know they've got a name for them. I'd have to look it up, but they totally present as women. They talk like women, paint their nails, long hair, but they are men, and they are referred to as biologically men, but they've got another name where they're just, yeah, you're men who like presenting as women. And I feel like this is ultimately a language problem. And we do have language like being a feminine man. Man and women are the biological factors, whereas feminine and masculine are the your outside how you want to interact with the world perspective. And I actually don't think a lot of people would have a problem if people wanted to go full out. Like I get, well, I mean, some people might have a problem, but less of one, where people are like, I full out get surgery to look like a woman. Every day I go out in the world, painted nails, speak like a woman, everything. But yeah, I'm just biologically a man, but I'm feminine. I'm a feminine man. I
Yeah.
just don't. But for me, then there's a different category to that, which is people with gender dysphoria, which is a different group than people who are just wanting to present how they want to present.
Yeah. So okay, so there's I guess I want to address that, and I also kind of want to get back to this the I guess the idea of lived experience or whatever. So I guess firstly, with regards to the idea that maybe your claim is that, well, being trans actually might involve some kind of a denial of reality or some kind of a false claim, because the word woman, the like correct definition of the word woman does mean female. Um, and so I think this almost gets into like some weird philosophical territory, but I'm just going to totally reject the idea that that there is any sort of valid concept about a correct or surrounding I guess a correct definition of a word. At best, you can say that they're using a word in a way that I would prefer they didn't use that word. But if that's your claim, then your claim is actually wait really quickly. I have to say a couple things. So really quickly, so yeah, I guess at best that's all you can say is they're using the word in a way that I have a preference or I have some normative goal that dictates that they ought to use the word differently. But if that's your claim, then that's not actually the same as the claim that their claim is incorrect or is an error or is denying reality in any way, because then yeah, it's just a different claim. That the claim that they should be using the word in a different way versus they're in error, they're denying reality in terms of the substance of what they're actually saying. Those are two very different things. And also, I would sort of contest the idea that when you say that there is a correct definition of a word, I guess ostensibly what you mean is that this is the way people use the word, like in general in society. But I'm going to actually contest that claim, right? If we're going to talk about, I mean, if you run polls in terms of who does the general public recognize trans women under their definition of the word women, that's going to be like half the population or more who says yes to that question. So I don't think that a sort of a conservative has any more of a claim to the idea that this is how people use the word woman than somebody who advocates for the validity of trans people, I guess. So,
I
um,
have a lot of questions.
yeah. So, really quickly, the last thing I wanted to say is just in terms of the idea that we already have a word for these people. Ostensibly, we have words like femboys and we have words like tomboys. I don't actually think that these are I don't think that these words are actually referring to what we want to refer to when we talk about trans people. These words are referring to people who identify as the gender that they were, I guess, that coincides with the sex they were assigned at birth, but often likes to express their gender in a way that's more, I guess, expansive. When we're talking about trans people, we're talking specifically about people who have a desire to identify and be recognized as a gender which does not coincide with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And I would also separate that because you said, well, we can have people with dysphoria. I would separate people who are trans from people who have dysphoria just sort of as a matter of definitions. And in terms of dysphoria refers to a condition that trans people often have where they experience extreme psychological distress as a result of their gender not coinciding with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Whereas the concept of just being trans is just the state of having a gender that does not coincide with the sex you were assigned at birth. But you don't necessarily have to experience psychological distress as a result of that in order to have that component, which is all it means to be trans.
Okay, so that's interesting. The reason that I would distinguish dysphoria from just being trans is because so often the argument is made the reason we need to affirm the transgender view of the world is because people will kill themselves. So that is a far more compelling argument to me than whether it's true or not. It's still a more compelling argument than just we need to do it because we said so, right? So that's, and lots of people make this argument and say anyone who disagrees with transgender policy or the idea of transgenderism or pronouns, they are a murderer because, these people need help and medically need help. And that's why I draw that line in the sand. So I'm like, no, 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 you don't get to use that argument for this whole group of people that just want to change their gender expression on a daily basis. Now, your argument, if I understand it correctly, is that when transgender individuals use the word woman or man, they believe or feel it has a different definition than the way someone else or a conservative would use it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I guess like a really simple way of putting this would be like, because a lot of people will draw like well, what if I say I'm like I think Ben Shapiro does the thing where he's like, well, what if I say, I'm a attack helicopters? Does that mean I'm an attack helicopter? Well, I mean, if when you say I'm an attack helicopter, what you literally mean is that you like are the same as a literal attack helicopter, then no, that's an incorrect claim. In the same way that if a trans person said I'm a woman and what they meant is I have XX chromosomes, that would be a literal incorrect claim. But if you said I'm an attack helicopter and what you mean by that is like, I don't know, I enjoy flying and I like to wear like a green apparel, like the color of an attack helicopter, and these kinds of things. And that's all you meant when you said that, then your claim that I'm an attack helicopter wouldn't actually be a false claim. And so, yeah, I think so. If trans people say I'm a woman, and they're not meaning that they're a different biological sex, they're just meaning that they have a certain set of desires and preferences, and they actually do have those desires, then the claim that they're a woman isn't going to be a false claim.
Okay, so in that case, if I were to go up to Ben Shapiro and say, no, you are not an attack helicopter, technically my statement would still be true, but he would turn to me and respond by saying, it was an expression of speech, Lauren. Don't be silly. But not once have I ever heard transgender activists saying this was an expression of speech. They don't, and that sounds like what you're suggesting is that this is simply a speech expression.
Well, I would actually disagree with that. So if Ben Shapiro said I'm an attack helicopter and that's what he meant, and you walked up to him and said, no, you're not an attack helicopter, it wouldn't be that you're actually correct and he was just using a figure of speech. If that's what he meant, then his claim actually wasn't wrong at all. And it would be wrong to say that he was wrong. Because if that's what he means by a specific word, you can't say that. There is no, like, I guess, external dimension that gives us correct definitions of words, right? At best, you can say you're using a word that is out of the norm for how I think people should use this word and for how people generally do use this word. Now, I don't think that's going to be the case for the term woman as it pertains to whether or not trans women fall within that category. Um, but yeah, I don't think it would be an error for Ben Shapiro to say something like "I'm an attack helicopter" if that's all he meant and he was correct about it.
Okay, so Oh, this is really difficult because now we're talking about allowing people to self-define words as they use them that are not the popular definition. And this is one gripe I really have with a lot of progressives is it's like, can you not see how this would make it impossible for the public to grasp these concepts
No,
when
so I'm not actually claiming that. I'm not making a normative claim that we should allow people, or that, yes, that society should simply just allow people to make up whatever definition they want for a word. All I'm saying is that if somebody makes a claim, right? If they make a claim, right, in terms of how they were what they were using the words in that claim to refer to, they haven't said anything that's wrong. Then you can't say, just is a matter of like just pure like logic. Like, you can't say that they've said anything that's wrong in any sense, right? Because a definition is not a proposition, right? If I define something in a given way, it's not a truth apt statement. So, yeah, it's like definitions just aren't things that are capable of being like right or wrong, I guess. At best, we can talk about what definitions we get the most utility out of. That's really all we could say.
but, like if I were in a classroom and I was doing a university test or quiz, and I handed my assignment in and I gave the wrong answer, but I felt like it was the right answer. I was like, no, 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 this is what I meant by the definition. And my teacher said, no, literally, this is the definition. Here's the textbook. You have to use it literally. Otherwise, I don't know if you understand the course correctly. I don't know what you're referring to. Like, there are reasons we have definitions. There are reasons we have normative speech that we all kind of understand so we can understand what we're talking about. So to me, if we did this thing where it was like, okay, woman, sorry, changing my sitting, woman, man, feminine, masculine, all of these things become a bit up to people's interpretation, and people get to say, this is just my expression. What I think would inevitably develop out of that is we would come up with a new word to define biology. And we would just be like, okay, biology for women is uh, I don't know. I don't know, just to create a random word, and the biology for men is a random word as well, and we would define people that way when talking about their biology. But what I think would happen is you would have transgender activists then take that word and also try to obscure it as well. Because I think the point here actually, in a lot of cases, is not to just talk about gender expression, but they literally want to be seen as the opposite sex, where there's a lot of confusion being put out here by saying, oh, this is just about gender expression, this is just about expression. Um, no, I think if we created new words just to purely define biology, then transgender people would still, or activists, not all, there are, I've met some very, very reasonable people with gender dysphoria that consider themselves transgender, but a lot of the activists would say, no, 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 this is biology. We are biologically the opposite sex, and you have to refer to us as that.
Yeah. So I think that we're conflating a couple things here. So, well, firstly, I don't want to get too caught up on what I said about definitions. Maybe I'm just not explaining it clearly because. So I guess what you were trying to say is like, well, the problem with my argument is that we can't just start. It wouldn't be good for us to start just self-defining any word that we want to self-define. And I agree with that. So I'm not making a normative claim that we should start self-defining words. All I was saying is that if I say, I am a woman, and what I mean by the term woman is, just like I desire to, act like a woman, be recognized as a woman, etc. If that's all I mean by the term woman, then when I say I'm a woman, I'm not actually making a statement that is incorrect in any way. The only way you could dispute
If
that
someone
statement
that
is
you
by
call
saying
you
that
a
I'm
man,
using the word in a way that you think is not a good way to use the word, right? And you can make that argument, right? Like, you can say that like we can't just start self-defining words, or we shouldn't define women in terms of gender expression, etc. But you can actually say that the claim that I made was somehow incorrect in a technical sense. Um,
If I
So,
called you a man, would that then be incorrect? If you said you were a woman and wanted to identify as a woman, if I responded and said you were a man and I meant it to mean your biology, could you then turn to me and say I was lying and I was incorrect?
no, if you say that I'm a man, if I'm a trans woman and you say that I'm a man, and what you mean by man is just you have like X, Y chromosomes or something
Which is
like that.
what people 99.9% of the time mean when they say that.
Well, so that I'm going to dispute, but yeah.
Okay,
So I will accept what you said is that if I'm a trans woman, you say you're a man, and by man you mean XY chromosomes, then you haven't said anything incorrect. That's not the argument that I would make. I wouldn't argue that you've said anything that's
so why
technically.
aren't
Wait,
we
wait, really quickly.
wrong?
I wouldn't say that you've said anything that's technically
Wrong.
wrong in terms of how you meant what you said. What I would say is that we would get more utility if we used the word man to not refer to XY chromosomes. So yeah, that's generally the argument that I'll make.
This is what I mean. Because I feel this when we talk about utility, I personally feel feminine and masculine were great utility for describing gender roles. It seems as though you feel woman and man are better utility for describing people, how they not their sex, but how they interact with the world at large. I thought we already had that. I thought feminine and masculine did that, but maybe it's woman and man. So then next
Well,
we'll just have to create another definition to define the sexes. And this is what I'm saying. I don't think that is going to fly because I genuinely believe that when people even are very definitive and they say, okay, you are a trans woman, but you are biologically a man, trans activists lose it. They say, no, that's not true. That's false. How dare you say that? So I don't, you're arguing on this point that this is all about gender expression, which sounds a lot more reasonable to me than what a lot of people argue on. But I think that you are not part of a lot of the, or you do not actually share views with a lot of the transgender activists that people are debating and going against in this larger culture war of kind of conservatives debating with transgender individuals. Because, as I said, if it were simply a matter of this is my gender expression, when someone said, okay, but this is your biology, there wouldn't be any outrage. It would just be, yeah, that's true.
sorry. So you're saying there shouldn't be outrage when someone says that trans women are
Well,
men
no,
because
what I'm
you're.
saying is if this is what transgender activists believe transgenderism is, it's simply gender expression and not their biology, there would be no outrage when conservatives said, okay, you're a trans woman, but you're still biologically a man. And that causes mass outrage. People try to kick them off campuses for saying that. That's like, that's seen as unacceptable bigotry. TERFs, people are called TERFs for pointing out biological differences, and they get kicked out of feminist groups and LGBT groups all the time. So
Well,
I do not think that, I think that this is a bit of a slip, I'm not saying you're doing it intentionally, but I do think it's a bit slippery to pretend that this is what the average argument is from people. I do not think that's the case.
yeah. So I'm not. So all I'm claiming is that when trans women say that they're a woman, they don't. What they mean is not that they have um, XX chromosomes. They just mean this is my gender expression. Now, what you're saying seems to be, well, then if that's the case, then why is there so much outrage when conservatives claim that, conservatives point out that, well, you have this biology. Now, um, what I don't want to do, I will answer that, but what I don't want to do is, I guess, get too caught up in arguing about how discourse often goes, the kind of meta conversation. I'm not super interested in that. But what I will say is that I think a lot of the outrage that you see is because so I don't think anybody would be outraged if there was a doctor who told their patient, hey, you have these biologically female, if that's how you want to call it, sex characteristics, so you need, this specific treatment that's tailored to how your body works. I don't think anybody would care about that. What people care about is the fact that conservatives often weaponize these things like saying biological woman or biological man to almost to sort of get a rise out of trans people or to try and undermine trans people's desire to be seen as a man or a woman in some way, or try to yeah, I guess sort of undermine the efforts for trans women to be seen as women and for trans men to be
Well,
seen
no, because
as men.
when we
So
talk about women, most people think that means biologically female, and that is definitely something we need to understand. When you interact with someone, when you go to the doctor's office, when you're going to date someone, when we talk in conversations, we generally do want to, and in some cases desperately need to, know the biology of another person. And that's why we have had these simplified pronouns. That's why we have had these simplified terms, woman and man. So when you go into the doctor's office, you say, this is my sex. I may express my gender differently, but this is my sex. I'm a woman, I'm a man, so that you know what you're doing, you know what kind of medicine you need to give me, you know what kind of checkups need to happen. When I go on a date, this is my sex. These are the sex organs I have. This is what my bio. Are we going to be able to? Maybe you really want kids and you really want your own kids with someone. I'm going to want to know the sex of the person that I'm going on a date with. All of these things matter in day to day life. I want to join a sports team. Well, are you a man or a woman? Are you going to join the women's team or the man's team? This is why these very useful sex terms exist. And once again, I'm not like, I don't see how obscuring this is not hurting all of these different categories of how we interact with the world.
yeah, so in terms of the things you brought up, I don't see how it's at all necessary to define man and woman in terms of biological um, traits in order to achieve the ends that you want to achieve. So, for example, when we're talking about a doctor's office, we can very easily say that trans women should be called women, trans men should be called men, but in the context of a doctor's office, the doctor should still be making decisions for their patient on the basis of the biological features that their patient has. We can still very easily say that we should call trans women women and trans men men, but if you're
Okay,
going on a
so
date and you have preferences for
say
a certain wait really
transgender.
quickly, I have to finish really quickly. So you can still say that trans women are women and trans men are men, and also say that if you're going on a date with somebody and you have strict genital preferences, like I only like people with penises, or I only like people with vaginas, you can still say that maybe you should still make that clear to your partner. This is something that I got a lot of flack for saying, is that if you're trans and you have genitals that don't align with the gender that you express yourself as, and you're hooking up with somebody, you should probably tell them what genitals you have beforehand. So you can
You
say all of
acknowledge
these things without saying that men should be like considered a biological thing. Sorry.
you acknowledge a lot of people are arguing that you shouldn't have to do that though. Like you said, you got flack for it.
So there are a lot of people online who will argue a lot of things, but what I don't want to start doing is building positions on very consequential issues around the voices of very inconsequential people. So, and I'm not going to deny that there are some more consequential people who say certain crazy things, but I don't think that just because there are people on one side who say things that are crazy, I don't think that that implies that I guess we have to go all the way over to the other end and start making similarly strange claims. Um, so
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Um, yeah, I think this really comes down to a disagreement of definitions in a lot of cases, and which words are more useful than others. And I think as we move forward in this sort of transgender restructuring of the West, we are going to figure out which words are more useful and which words are less useful. Because you have to remember the normative words that like male and female referring to biology, she and her referring to your biology, all of that, that has been the standard. And it is a small group of people that are trying to change that standard. So we don't actually know yet whether these new words are more useful or whether they're going to deeply complicate things. I personally am of the belief that they are going to deeply complicate things and they're not going to be more helpful. Does this mean that I hate transgender people and don't think people should be allowed to get surgeries and present how they want with whatever gender they want? Of course not. I have friends of mine that are transgender that are lovely people. Do I think that changes their biology? No, I don't think that changes their biology. Do I disrespect them as a human? Uh, no, I don't. I
yeah,
respect them much and love them. There are a lot of friends I have that make decisions that I think are bizarre, make life choices that I wouldn't make myself. But I'm like, that's your life choice. But what this comes down to for me is we are trying to set a brand new social structure. We are trying to set a new way of communicating and interacting with the world and each other, and I do not think it is helpful. And I mean, this is a whole nother debate that we'd need a whole nother day for, and I certainly don't think this is helpful to put on children. I think that we need way more research into hormone blockers. There have been no medical trials done around hormone blockers for transgenderism so far. And I just, I think there's so much shutdown of honest conversation around this topic. I really appreciate you talking to me about it and being patient and describing how you view it. And I do think that you have a more reasonable perspective than some of the people that I see arguing about this online, and I respect that. But yeah, to me, I think this comes down to definitions, and I do not think that the definitions coming out of a lot of the LGBT activists and progressive activists are making sense and adding up to most people. And I think there's going to be way more confusion that comes ahead because of this, whether it be in sports, dating, laws, medicine. And I think we've got some big challenges to face as a community, as a society, which are going to be balanced between how do we interact and still like have some facts that we're dealing with here while still trying to respect people, and certainly respect people that are struggling with mental illness. That's going to be a tough
Yeah.
balancing.
Yeah. So I want to address some of those things, but yeah, I guess we can move on after this
I
because
do
there were some
have to
things.
go, remember.
What did you say?
I do have to go here soon, but we can do one more little back and forth, and I definitely
Yeah.
want to hear that.
Yeah. So really quickly, just to I guess give my broad overview of that before I start to I guess try and get into something that you were saying earlier. So yeah, so I guess my broad overview, and I guess to just right here, I guess respond to some of the things that I haven't, that I didn't get the opportunity to respond to, a little bit earlier. So it seems like broadly, it is just going to come down to I believe we get more utility out of a definition of woman that is inclusive of trans women. And my argument for that is relatively straightforward. I think that we have a lot of evidence that when we're talking about people who are trans, who want to be treated as a woman and who identify as a woman, there's a lot of evidence that it just increases their well being, especially if they have dysphoria, to call them a woman, recognize them as a woman in society, right? Now, there's a lot of concerns that you brought up, things like what about a doctor's office? What about, in the concept, in what about dating? What about sports? All these kinds of things. I think basically all of these things can be resolved without holding the position that we ought to call trans women men and that we ought to call trans men women. So, for example, if we're talking about like dating, as long as we just make it clear to people what genitals we have, as long as we're transparent about that, as long as in the doctor's office the doctor is still making decisions around what biological features they know you have, as long as in sports, if we can still create certain like divisions for different kinds of people on the basis of different physical features that they have that might give them an unfair advantage. I think we can resolve all of these things without like calling trans women men, which seems to have pretty detrimental effects to their mental health. And I don't think that I don't think that we have any other definitions like feminine or masculine that really capture that, right? Feminine and masculine. There can be masculine women, feminine boys, and that's fine. But these terms are always going to refer to people who still identify with the gender that coincides with the sex that they were assigned birth. So when we're talking about trans people, I think we're talking about something else, something that isn't captured by those kinds of
Their sex.
terms. Sorry, what?
So their sex. We're talking about their sex, it seems, not their gender. Because you just said feminine and masculine is just gender, where they still
Yeah.
coincide with sex. That would make transgender being someone who wants to change the sex.
Somebody who identifies, yeah, with a gender that doesn't coincide with their sex, right? Whereas somebody who's just a femboy is still going to identify as a boy, but they just often present in more
But
feminine ways.
their gender is more feminine.
Yeah, their gender expression at
Just like
least, but I think an internal identity is also a relevant consideration in determining what gender someone is. So just because you express yourself maybe more in traditionally feminine ways, that doesn't make you a woman unless you have a set of internal desires that such that your gender identity corresponds to being a woman as well. Um, but I want to really quickly, I want to, I guess, get into some of the stuff that we were talking about a bit earlier before we went on the sort of more definition tangent thing. So we were making claims about therapy and puberty blockers and desistance and cosmetics. And so I'll give my sort of broad take on this. It seems to be in my case, um, or in my opinion, it seems to be the case that when we're talking about the idea that you brought up of, well, why can't trans women just be taught to, be happy with their bodies rather than changing their bodies? Um, well, the reason is that it seems like the evidence currently suggests that that's not really a viable strategy. So the evidence kind of pretty strongly, in my opinion, we could get into our disagreement about this. The evidence pretty strongly suggests that if you're a trans woman and you have a desire to have gender confirmation therapies, getting those therapies is going to be significantly beneficial to your well being in a way that just having therapy that tries to make you feel better without having that desired surgery, that's never going to be as effective or even nearly as effective in terms of deterring things like suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, etc. You made this sort of comparison to cosmetics. Well, what about people who just want to change? They want to look like a different race. They want to have, maybe bigger boobs or something like that. Um, Sorry, what?
I'm getting a call from my son's daycare. It may be an emergency. I'm
Okay, that's
sorry.
true. Yeah. Oh, wait a second.
Hello? Hi, I'm well. How are you? Oh, okay. I'll be right there. Okay, I'll be right there. Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye. I'm so sorry. It's an emergency. My son is very
Gotcha.
sick. Do you want to do closing statements? I really apologize.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah,
I'll
just
let you.
yeah. So, in terms of cosmetics, right, there is a concern, or there is this sort of, I think, a meaningful symmetry breaker there, where when we're talking about people who just want cosmetics, there's no real robust evidence that getting cosmetics will significantly decrease your likelihood of suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, right? Whereas I think there is that sort of evidence when we're talking about transitioning, and I guess on the issue of desistance, because this was kind of the sort of the point that led us here. On the point of desistance, well, you say like, well, why don't we just let people grow out of it? Well, the problem is, firstly, there's no evidence that giving somebody puberty blockers makes them less likely to, or it makes them like more likely to stay trans as opposed to if they didn't get puberty blockers. You see a lot of studies where, well, people who got more, or people who were given puberty blockers were more likely to not desist. But the reason for that is because people who were given puberty blockers are specifically selected to be the types of people who clinicians predicted weren't going to desist anyways. So we really have no evidence that puberty makes otherwise desisting likely people not desist. And in fact, we can look at very strong correlates for desistance. So, for example, you're more likely to desist if in childhood you describe having more opposite sex friends, if you describe that you believe you are the other gender as opposed to merely wishing that you were the other gender. There's a lot of correlates that we can find that makes it more likely for someone to not desist. So when people talk about like, oh, well, these are the desistance rates, the problem is you're looking at trans people in general, not the specific group of people who a competent clinician would diagnose with puberty blockers, right? Because this is more of a careful selection process, I guess. So yeah, do you have any disagreements with that specifically? Do you have any disagreements on the
Yeah.
efficacy of transitioning, I guess?
I think that we can't. So when you mention surgeries helping reduce suicide, I would like to see the studies that you are talking about, because I think a lot of studies that are just talking about um, transgender people enjoying their surgeries or saying they felt better afterwards, or the questions are structured in ways that say, were you treated nicer at work after you got your nose job or your
Well, I'm
facial
talking
done?
specifically about suicidal ideation here. So,
Okay, so a
yeah.
lot of those studies are conflated. as studies that say this works and prevents suicide. In fact, a bunch of the studies in, for example, the Cornell meta-analysis are just that. They're studies on, did you like your surgery? They're studies
Yeah.
on that have nothing to do with suicide ideation, and yet that is used all the time as an example. So I don't know what studies you're talking about, but I'd have to take a look at them first, because I find so often data is misrepresented on both sides, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah,
Um,
really quickly, just so to be really clear, and I'll put the links to everything that I said in the description so people can call me out if I'm just lying or some shit like this. But so yeah, so I agree like a lot. I will agree with you that a lot of studies are bad, and studies are bad usually because studies doing like a double-blind controlled trial with a proper control group is really hard when studying trans people. So usually what you do is you either just look at a group of trans people over time and see were they doing better after surgery, or you ask people, hey, do you feel better after doing surgery, or you look at a group of people after surgery and you compare them to the general population of trans people before surgery. The problem with doing the first two things is you're comparing trans people who had surgery to where they're at now compared to where they were, instead of what you should be doing, which is comparing them where they are now to where they would have been now had they not had surgery. And the problem with number three, and this is sort of one of the issues with, I thought it was going to come up. I guess that's not going to happen. One of the studies that I think I talked with Destiny about this, that you've cited, the Brandstrom and Pachinkas one. The issue is when you're comparing trans people who have transitioned to a control group that just looks at the general population of trans people who haven't transitioned, a lot of those trans people who haven't transitioned because they weren't experiencing enough psychological distress to warrant transitioning in the first place, right? And so, because of these broad methodological issues, there's two studies that I like to reference. One of them was from JAMA, one of them was from the Transpulse Project. The JAMA one came out like a couple months ago. The Transpulse Project one is from 2013. And the reason these studies are, I think, generally better than all the other studies that people talk about, like, the Cornell ones or whatever the fuck, it's not a very good literature review, but I'll leave that behind. The reason these studies are better is because they specifically are comparing trans people who have transitioned to a control group of trans people who reported that they desired to transition but haven't yet. And so I think these are really the only two studies that have had a proper control group, and both of them find pretty robust effects of transitioning on the likelihood of things like suicidal ideation in the past year, likelihood of suicide attempts, and these kinds of things. But obviously, I know that you're not going to be able to like debunk a study on the fly or something. That's more just for the audience.
I appreciate you recognizing that. Didn't want to get into the
Yeah,
library situation Hunter and I got
yeah, yeah,
into.
yeah.
Well,
That's just for the audience. Yeah.
yeah, well, we both debunk each other's studies live here.
Right. Yeah.
Um, we're gonna have to do a chat with Destiny or something. We can bring him in and we can get into the data, because unfortunately, I do have to go take care of my child, and having internet debates on who lives is not a good
Yeah. Yeah.
fun. But this was fun talking about the philosophical stuff. Because it seems like you really want to get into that data and the studies, let's do a chat
Mhm.
soon about that.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to. And yeah, thanks for having me on and talking.
Yeah.
I'd make a formal statement, but I am pushing it with time here.
Yeah. Just last thing, really quickly, because he's gonna kill me if I don't bring it up. I think Avi wants to talk with you if you're free anytime. He wanted me to ask you if you would talk with him, but that's for you guys to resolve. Yeah.
Man, I'm on a busy schedule. I'm like the
Yeah.
only person who will talk to any of you guys, or vice versa. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it'd be like that sometimes.
It do be like that. Actually, I think there are a lot that would like to do internet debates, but everyone's so turned off talking to each other lately.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyways, this was a pleasure. I really enjoyed myself. You
Mhm.
are a joy to speak to, and I will see you next time.
Yeah. See ya. Talk to you some other time.
Recording stopped.
Recording stopped. Okay. Well, that was fun. Um, shit. Fucking, I'm gone. Hold on. Uh, okay. Oh no. Okay, here I am. Hi. Okay, so that was fun. Um, I think that went well. Got to bring up most of the stuff. At least I got to bring up the empirical stuff at the end. I was hoping to be able to do that. Um, yeah, so in terms of my notes, I'm not sure, because there was a period there where I felt like I was kind of not aggressive enough in terms of like not letting myself be cut off. But yeah, I'm not sure if there was anything that I didn't get to address. So yeah, the therapy thing. There was this point about yeah, I addressed all that in the sort of the closing statements. Oh shit, I didn't get to address the lived experience thing. Yeah, so I mean, well, I guess that was sort of just part of more broadly what I was talking about. Um, um, with the idea that there are issues with calling men men and trans women women that just can't be resolved. Um, and one of these things was like, oh well, what if trans people are talking with cis women about their lived experience? I'm not really sure how that's an issue, um, because even cis women, among different cis women, are going to have very different lived experiences. Um, a cis woman, um, for example, a black cis woman is going to have a very different lived experience from a white cis woman. There's lots of different groups of cis women who are going to have very different lived experiences. So I think having different types of women who have different lived experiences from one another talking about those different lived experiences, I don't see how that's necessarily an issue um, with using the definition of woman that I want to use. By the way, what I'm doing here is not just like trying to, post mortem own Lauren Southern. I just want to like, in case there was any sort of things that people weren't clear on that I didn't get to address, and you were maybe wondering how I would respond. This is just sort of giving you the opportunity to demonstrate that, I guess. Um, yeah, this repeated. Yeah, I already addressed that. Yeah, the definition thing was weird. I feel like she wasn't totally tracking what I was saying there. So, what I'm not saying is that it's like normatively a good thing if people just start defining words however they want to. What I was saying is that if you make a claim and what you mean by that claim in terms of you could be using the word in a very idiosyncratic way. But if when you say the word the sentence that comes out, given the correct interpretation of what you meant when you said those words, if there's no error in that sentence, right? So if I say I'm an attack helicopter and all I mean is I like to wear the color green, I like to fly, maybe I like to parachute or whatever, if that's all I mean, then I might be using the word helicopter in a very idiosyncratic way, and you might be able to make a moral or a normative argument that I should be using the word helicopter in a different way. But saying that I should be using the word in a different way isn't the same as saying that the statement I made was somehow incorrect, right? Because a definition of a word, you can't say that I was incorrect because my statement is incorrect in virtue of using a definition that you don't like, because a definition of a word is not going to be a proposition. It's not truth apt, and therefore there is no possibility for any word to be correct or incorrect. So that's all I meant by the definition stuff, in case anybody was tripped up about that. Yeah, um, there is, yeah, I think I've addressed everything. Yeah, okay, cool. Sorry, I'm a bit, I'm like, it's pretty late right now, so I've been pretty tired throughout this debate, but hopefully I, kept it together sufficiently such that I was coming across as, somewhat coherent. But, yeah, I appreciate everybody watching. I would give a shout out to my patrons, but I don't actually know where my fucking piece of paper is with my list of patrons. I have so much, because I'm rolling in cash and fame. But yeah, all right. See you next time.